To get started, I'd like to introduce Dr. Alexander Felson, who's an urban ecologist, a registered landscape architect, and an assistant professor at Yale. His research focuses on integrating ecological understanding and research methods with urban design and land development strategies to study and shape the feedbacks, adaptive capacity, vulnerability, and resilience of coupled human and natural systems. And with that, I'd like to introduce Alex. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks. Sure. Hello, everybody. Thank you. All right, well, I have a couple different examples of projects to show you that are really trying to deal with the current challenges that we face, having built and urbanized along coastal areas, and where this is a group of people who prioritize and value ecosystems along the coast and trying to figure out how to sort of manage those ecosystems and coordinate potential funding opportunities and rehabilitation of urban areas for ecosystem function. So I actually have a background. I'm a landscape architect and registered in New York, and then I did a PhD in ecology and evolution at Rutgers, and have been working for quite a while, although some people have said I look young today. I just got a haircut this morning, so maybe that's it. I've been working for a while on trying to integrate ecological research and ecological science with urban design projects and landscape architecture projects. And coastal adaptation and the funding and the challenges we face today are a big opportunity for someone like me who's trying to find opportunities in funding and in the perspective or perception of land managers and city governments for change and adaptation. So I worked on the Rebuild by Design project, so I'm going to talk a little bit about that in Bridgeport, but also I've worked on a couple of other planning projects in Guilford and a bioretention garden in Seaside Village, and I'm going to try to link them together. All right? So please, if you have questions, it seems pretty informal, so we can stop me and ask if you would like further info. This is a map of the inland waterways in Bridgeport and the kind of the challenges that Bridgeport as a city faces. 16 square miles, a lot of low-lying land, less than 50% tax. 50% of the landowners are paying taxes. There's a high mill rate. It's a lot of challenges. They're looking for more land and more development, and they are going to have less in the future and more land at risk. So, and when you look at these kind of systems, the red is the FEMA payouts for repetitive flood loss housing. So you can see even internally in the city of Bridgeport, you've got inland waterways that are actually problematic for the city. And so, it's not just coastal systems. But, sorry, it's a little jumpy. I'm going to talk first about a project that I worked on in Seaside. This is the south end here, the downtown Bridgeport's here. I don't know if people have been in that area, but Seaside Park, Seaside Village, is a pretty interesting historic village. So when you think about Bridgeport, one of the things that we were communicating with the city managers was that there are different conditions of the city. When you think about a cross-section of the city, you have upland water coming from the Pequannock and Rooster River, and you've got the city and urbanization and rainfall, and then you've got the coastal conditions and flooding events and storm events. And so those require different adaptation solutions when you think about it from an ecological standpoint as well as from an urban design standpoint. So here's the historic image of Seaside Village. For those that haven't been there, it's considered the best example of a garden city actually in the U.S., or one of the top examples. And it's this early 19th century town planning, kind of pre-car, where the housing has a typology and it's consistent across the housing styles. So they're actually really small units, but they look nice, and they're it's really pretty and quaint. And actually that's great because of that quality and what people value of Seaside Village, it's become a you gotta be careful of these things. It's become a kind of the fact that it's historic is seen as valuable, and so even though this is the the flood zone, 100-year floodplain, and it's in the BE area, the AE area, people are trying to figure out how to preserve it and how to manage this, and subsequently other values like Marina Village, which is a low-income community, and University of Bridgeport, are all being considered in terms of how to manage for flood events. Obviously these kinds of negotiations and the kind of challenges that we face on land like this is actually fairly complex and multi-layered, and you're really thinking about the local residents and their perspective, as well as the government, state government and funding potential, and even federal government, like the Rebuild by Design, which was a federal funded project. So the federal government was looking for solutions, but trying to figure out how to work at the local residential scale and to get people in the community on board. And that's actually not a simple task. And when you think about the green, the Bridgeport 2020, for example, and some of the documents that are out there for green infrastructure in Bridgeport, which are kind of important, building blocks to where we try to build on and develop from. And also there's a lot of participants that are at Save the Sound, UConn, and others who are contributing. When you look at their recommendations, a lot of the challenges have to do with logistics and coordination, actually. So it's interesting to think about. It's not just infrastructure and physical, but it's also about coordinating information and getting these kinds of goals embedded in other management and maintenance regimes within the city. Okay, so here's the site, Seaside Village, built in 1893. And this is the floodways of Bridgeport. And here's Aranistan Avenue. I don't know if people have been out here when it floods. It's actually really hard to get through. Aranistan is problematic in a lot of ways, but you can use things like the coastal resilience tool that the Nature Conservancy has developed. I'm not sure if others have visited this website and looked at your house, for example, in the future, but I use this periodically. It's a nice simple tool that anybody can access, and so they can kind of work through different layers and different assumptions about hurricane events in the future.
Is there a NOAA tool?
There is this tool is on the Nature Conservancy website. It was the Columbia Goddard Institute, which should be on there, but actually, yeah, sorry, it's Columbia and the Nature Conservancy. The Coastal Resilience tool is a little bit mislabeled, but NOAA was funded it through Columbia, which should be on there. But there's also great value to ground truthing and to learning about a site locally. And ultimately, when you're dealing with that residential level and you're trying to coordinate with a community, you need to get out on the ground and have some feedback. So what we did with one of my classes was to go out when it was raining in Seaside Village a couple times and map out flow patterns and essentially identify sub-basin watersheds. And this just shows you where it floods through the neighborhood. And this is important. This is the parking area where it was flooding quite a bit. And this was actually where we ended up building a green infrastructure pilot project to help the community understand what it will take to develop green infrastructure and bioretention gardens. Ultimately, our interest was, thinking about sub-basin watershed neighbors. So rather than your neighbor across the street, if you identify your sub-basin watershed neighbor, you can work together to develop collective green infrastructure and alleviate some of the pressure on downstream flooding in the city of Bridgeport, where they have two municipal systems. They are often taxed. The low-level neighborhoods like Seaside end up having flooding because the sewage can't take up enough of the water during the big rain events. And so it's partly about, not just about sort of infiltrating the water, but about managing water on site and framing water. So we had this idea of a collective stormwater. We tried to get a group together. I don't know if people have had this experience, but it's never easy to get a group of homeowners to want to participate in a program like this where they would retrofit their gardens and create a multi-layered treatment bioretention swale system. Yes?
Is that shared space? Is that, or they have property lines? Or
yeah, good question. It's a homeowners, they have a homeowners association, and they actually have a full-time management staff. And so it was one of these unusual situations where you can actually get a community in the room and talk about this and present this idea to the community members. Ultimately, though, the unit size and the spaces that they have are small. So this was a pretty big commitment for the individuals. And what we designed was a segment of bioswale and a bioretention garden as a unit. And we just proposed it and designed it as a kind of garden style. But yeah, it's a hard sell. But on the other hand, there's a lot of flooding in the neighborhood.
So were those rain gardens?
Yeah, they're
so
rain gardens with.
Okay.
It's a rain garden with the interconnected bioswale that goes down to the storm drain.
Did you build it?
Well, I'm going to get to that. Yeah. So this kind of a curb cut, but also the interior rain garden strategies is what we were proposing. And these are just pictures of other projects. Okay, so this is the parking lot area where it floods, and this is like one of the rainfall events. A lot of times it's like a lake, not a lot of times, but at least twice a year, there's a big rain event, and the whole field becomes a kind of lake back there. So we were one of the things early on I heard from other engineers or from engineering individuals were, you don't want to build in a low-lying location like this because it's a high risk. You're going to have a high water table. You're not going to get much infiltration. It's going to fail. And then those early failures with green infrastructure are problematic for the whole, positioning of green infrastructure as a value to urban areas. But on the other hand, it's coastal, and it's one of these dynamic landscapes, and and it's an area that has some flexibility, and this community is stuck there. So we sort of took the position of, let's figure out what we can do and try to manage it over time and see if it's possible to still construct a green a storm drainage system, a bioretention system in this area. So this is actually during construction. You can see we had to pump multiple times to get this in. And essentially I set it up as what I call a designed experiment, which is I basically designed 6 swales equally sized, and I developed these dipper box systems that capture and distribute water equally between the pipes. It's actually kind of nice when it rains because it's sort of like a Japanese garden, like you hear them clunking, and then it comes out of each one at a different rate, at a different time slightly, which was kind of pretty. But anyway, this was pre-Irene, so we got the community out to and we developed the plantings, which of course all perished during because of the salinity that got flooded. The whole field got flooded, and the salt water stayed there for about 2 days, and then Sandy, we replanted, and then the same thing happened in Sandy. So you can imagine that it was interesting because the community there was at least a year in which the community basically said, well, at least it drains the parking lot. That was like the one thing that that was a saving grace of the project. And early on, I put in these. I designed it as a public amenity. By the way, these are all our work days. I brought in a project manager from UConn, Brian Kay, who was really fantastic, and we pumped the site I think at least 12 times in order to get these crafted and constructed, and it was a pain, but it was also like a reason to be out there. And when the community board shifted from the new generation, which had allowed us to even get this project going, back to the old generation leaders because they were so frustrated by the whole effort and by other things going on in the community, the old leader stood up and actually gave us a standing ovation, saying that we had been out there and we'd been working, and it was essentially our labor at the site that allowed us to kind of continue there, which was a pretty interesting experience. We worked with Groundwork Bridgeport. We worked with a bunch of different programs, TNC and others, just to get people out to work with this. So this was it's a stone soup model, not a lot of money, but the community gave $10,000, which was great because they kind of put skin in the game, which was kind of plus and negatives because they gave us a lot of opinions. But it was a good way to learn the community's perspective because they were certainly engaged or felt invested. And then I got $20,000 to set up the design experiment as a research experiment. So the coupling of experiment with what I designed as a public amenity brought value to the project and it sort of gave it more resilience, I would say. And then the city brought about $50,000 worth of materials and construction, and they basically built it using machinery. But you can see this distribution system to the 6 swales, designed as a public amenity with a path system, and the path was designed to kind of frame the water, as I was saying earlier, and it was also designed to drain down to this floodplain. I can show you. And then we modified the soil media, actually. So we modified sand content, 90, 80, and 70, I think, percent sand. So we really bumped up the organic matter to look at changes in organic matter and the impact on water holding capacity of the substrates. We also constructed we used this method developed in North Carolina where there was a clay liner about 3 feet down, or a clay layer. And so we cut through the clay layer, punched through it, and took out a piece and poured in sand to create these wicks with the idea that that would increase infiltration. In the end, we actually think that it created an opening for the water table below the clay liner to come up.
The head, the hydraulic head.
Exactly. So that's been an interesting experience as well. Here's the path we designed. So you can see this is the one place where we kind of added an aesthetic. Where you can see the curve. The whole idea here was to make a path that stayed above the water. So even when this whole field flooded, you'd have this kind of curved path. And it's actually kind of cool because the resident mallards and other ducks and other things, they'll hop between the ponds in this really funny way, and so you kind of have this interaction between the design landscape and the wildlife. And we put underneath the path a perforated pipe with geotextile, and so the path actually functions as a drainage system. Community day, and the design experiments concept that I was just describing, where we were coupling ecological research with urban design. My PhD work was I actually worked with a related company, and I set up migration studies on amphibian vernal pools as part of a large land development to guide where we put housing and road lot locations in that development. And I also developed a larval density study looking at habitat impact versus species density in ponds on survival as a way of basically integrating research so that we could test and evaluate more of the function of vernal pools in a development site. So it's been something that I've been interested in for a long time. And part of the idea, this is an article that I wrote on the Earth stewardship, which is this concept in ecology. Sorry, okay. Is that better? You guys having trouble hearing me? I'm talking too fast.
You could erase it.
Okay, sorry. I use the design process, and I know there's some landscape architects in the crowd. This box, a little abstract, is the design process. So a lot of times environmental consultants are involved in site analysis pre-design process, but they don't have a lot of influence on the design process. They might review. Urban ecologists are usually involved. They kind of want to study the city as is. So they're sort of after the design process doing research on the as-built city. And I'm interested in the design process itself as a iterative process where the designer can learn about the ecologist's goals, the ecologist can learn about the designer's goals, and they can collaboratively develop projects together that are both research-based and, push the boundary in terms of function, hopefully. So I was actually the project director for the Million Trees project in New York, which I set up as a design experiment with the Parks Department, and it's the largest urban forestry study in the world now. We have 4 years of data. It was a whole construction project, multi-year effort. And we're basically doing research on species recruitment patterns, tree vigor ratings with the U.S. Forest Service, looking at nursery performance and competition with invasives, as well as amended versus non-amended soils, and then we're looking at high diversity, low diversity.
So did you conceive of the Million Trees, or you just see?
I was working for AECOM at the time, and we won the contract for the reforestation plan for New York City, which was essentially the development of the Million Trees on public parkland, which was at that time 60%. It got bumped up to 80% of the project.
Can I ask questions about that?
Yeah.
So in doing the trees, did you take into account the value of the genetics of the existing trees, and where did you source your trees from?
Yeah. Okay, so the Million Trees is an interesting manifestation of the theory, the biodiversity and ecosystem functioning theory in ecology, which is, the argument that, the value of native planting, essentially. So that idea of that native plants are valuable translated into the Parks Department initiative. So we were required to plant all natives, which is, so yeah. So
a lot of natives could come from, Maryland.
Yeah. So procurement, yeah. Yeah, there are cloned, yeah. We're doing a study now with cloned natives, or cloned poplars and willows. But at the time, actually the procurement was a big issue because a lot of the nurseries around were skeptical that the Parks Department was actually going to deliver, or actually going to, we were looking at a multi-year demand of 500% or more of what they were typically producing. So it was a pretty big ask for the nurseries surrounding. So at the early stages, it was kind of a sort of a, like scrappy, wherever you can find it effort to. But Pinelands Nursery was a big one, and there was some, other nurseries until the Native Plant Center on Staten Island ramped up their production, which is essentially like an integrated plant nursery associated with the Parks Department. So then they are doing more genotype, local genotypes, but the early plantings that we did were not. They were sourced from all over, but mostly east. We were trying to keep within the NYC plan, the 2030 plan of, I think it was 100 or a couple hundred miles.
Are they monitoring to see the ones that maybe been outsourced that were not from the area that how well are they
Yeah.
thriving?
Okay, so I mean that's aside. This is so the originally when we applied, when we submitted for the RFP for this project, the monitoring they were interested in monitoring, but essentially it was live dead. So it's sort of like post implementation. What percentage is living, what percentage is dead, which doesn't give you a lot of information about the success or failure of the project. But keep in mind, it's a massive implementation project for the Parks Department that goes beyond what they're typically accustomed to. So it was a big, big deal. Sorry, I'm trying to lose my. It was a big ramping up for the Parks Department. So in other words, there was only so much they could get their mind around doing for this project. Even though our argument was, there's essentially 8 studies done on long-term urban forestry development in the world, and we don't really know how to construct a functioning native urban forest that well. Obviously, we have experience in the field, and that's coming into play. But what's going to work here? And there's pressures on this initiative. For example, the mayor and others wanted they wanted to see something. They didn't want it to be a bunch of seedlings, for 10 years. So we planted 5-year-old 2-gallon trees, which was expensive and also a carbon impact, when you think about what it takes to grow that and deliver it. So there's a lot of questions. Is this really, what are we gaining and what's the cost? But the Parks Department had experience with infill planting across their forests, and they used 2-gallon 5-year-old trees to outcompete invasives. With a pretty rigorous herbicide program, they were able to manage that and produce results. So that's what we were doing. So we identified 56 plots in a contractor-constructed research zone right by the Queens Botanical Garden, and we're monitoring those over time. So we have 4 years of monitoring data. That information is feeding back to the Parks Department. So, for example, last year they had a maintenance crew come out and do herbicide, and they accidentally cut down 6% of the planted trees. And also it was kind of a wet, cold year, and there was a rat infestation in the park, which was lovely. And they stripped 27% of the tree bark, which meant that a bunch of the trees went back down to a kind of seedling stage because the stalk died. And that means that they're no longer in competition really with the invasives. A bunch of the invasives are much bigger than they are now. So those kinds of that kind of learning process and coupling the research with management that's what we've been trying to cultivate with the Parks Department over time. The genotype analysis wasn't part of our early study just because we sourced all these trees from a bunch of locations and didn't really have that embedded as a variable that we could control. All right, good questions. I mean, and there's more. There's papers on this, so I could, if you wanted, I could link you to papers on the project. I got this. Oh wait, sorry, I'm going backwards. This was. This is not supposed to be there. This is my. Whoops. Okay, yeah. This is some of the views of the site. So you can see, there's a lot of local human pressure, as you can see, vandalism. There's vines and invasives that we talked about. There's kind of farming even out there. So and one of the big challenges we had was, in a normal experiment, you want to reduce variability so that you can really identify cause and effect. Out here, you've got the Parks Department, they're managing in certain ways. We ended up essentially treating the Parks Department as a kind of urban nature, recognizing that their management practices are unpredictable. And so, and I've mentioned the compost amendments, the tree diversity, and the shrub and herbaceous planting. And these were the species on the left that we were looking at. And so they have actually a slightly different growth rate and shade tolerance, which we were interested in studying as well. Yeah. Question? No? Okay. So in terms of measurements, this is what we're actually looking at. Tree performance, root collar diameter, height, biomass volumes. And then we've got the plot scale and the species scale that we're looking at. And we have these health metrics that we developed with the U.S. Forest Service. I'm getting a little sidetracked. And we're using chlorophyll and fluorescence as an assessment of plant health, for example, plant vigor rating. And so for the bioretention gardens in Bridgeport, these are the swales. Here's the dipper box. You can see I got the city to donate these large granite rock pieces and that was sort of strategic to kind of anchor the project. I was a little worried that midway through, as the community was, upset in some ways. For example, the health director was called about concerns over mosquito populations, and this is something that's going to continue to plague green infrastructure. And we need to get a handle on this a little bit, both in terms of communication with the public and in terms of coordinating with engineers and the priorities of engineers to drain these systems really quickly, where you can get some ecosystem function if you can monitor and manage the drainage rates of bioretention systems a little better than just going by a kind of 72-hour engineering protocol. But the health director called. I offered to do monitoring and look at some of the surrounding storm drains, and he said that the community doesn't really like data. They don't really respond to data. But he was out there with short sleeves, and he felt the mosquitoes, biting. And I think so. The point is that there's perception issues with green infrastructure, and we've got to deal with it over time. This was Sandy over in the top left. You can see it was the whole neighborhood had about 3 feet of water on it, so people were literally boating around. And so you can tell that this is a pretty tough spot, but the landscape has been pretty resilient given the kind of challenges that it faces. And and then it was a catalyst that helped. They had been trying to build a community garden here for the last decade, and we got this installed. And we kind of did this in a sort of guerrilla fashion, I would say. We brought the money, we brought Yale, UConn got together, and we just built it. And now they have installed a community garden and a dog park. So they renovated this whole side and developed a dog park where it was really a weedy grove before, and actually creating a kind of challenge for us to manage on our side. And then this community garden here in this neighborhood. So you're getting the kind of productive field landscape, and there's this kind of, it feels good when you see other things coming into play and other community members getting engaged, because that means that you're getting momentum and that your project has been adapted. And Seaside Village now, just actually this last time we were out, said that they were excited about the project, and that we want to use it as a way to position Seaside Village to get more federal funding moving forward. And so we've developed a set of resilience strategies for the community, using this as one, but then looking at others as well. And so now it's become, a flagship of the community's engagement and interest in coastal adaptation. So it's a kind of, I guess the moral is you can't really predict where these things are going to go over time and what opportunities you're going to have, but ultimately perseverance in this case paid off. And you can see from this kind of scale that you're dealing with a homeowner, but you're actually having kind of larger implications potentially on Bridgeport and its management of water. And there's kind of this temporal aspect where we needed to cultivate the relationship with the community and kind of stick with it for over time in order for it to actually get accepted. So there's these kind of complex challenges that we face around coastal adaptation, for example, where the FEMA 100-year storm is slowly evolving into the 500-year storm, and the kind of with sea level rise changing and other regulations coming down the pipeline. It's a pretty complicated situation for homeowners, and that's both good and bad. I think homeowners are looking for information and precedents, so I think prioritizing precedent projects and demonstrations is valuable. But on the other hand, we're all still learning, and I think there's a lot of lost opportunities that happen. I'm not sure what to say about that. But this process of engagement and dialogue, I think, is an area that is of great interest to me. And so I've been working also in Guilford. And when we asked the Guilford town managers and kind of the town engineer and planner, et cetera, the kind of board, what are the most important actions needed to protect Guilford from increased vulnerability due to storm surge and rising sea levels, 67% said, infrastructure and land use change, the physical changes. And then when we asked what are the obstacles to effective action regarding coastal resilience and climate change, 89% that said there was institutional and societal and personal factors. So even though we're thinking physical change, in order to do it, we need to coordinate and communicate the issues and actually have a dialogue. Yes?
Who's going to be maintaining those bioretention cells?
Good question, yeah. So what I've done, I'm working with Gabe Benoit at Yale now, who's a water hydraulic chemist, and we have a graduate student and got Hickson funding to have a graduate student do water quality monitoring and infiltration monitoring. So we've outfitted it with hobo, water loggers, and so she's out there actually like every other week. And then we have 2 work days in the summer. We try to keep it, like early summer, late summer, where we weed and manage the
And gradually, are you gonna give that over to the homeowners association? You're gonna give them an operation and maintenance plan?
Yeah, good question. I have homeowners engaged in the project who are participants, and they're essentially like gardeners. They've been great, but they're sparse, and I would like a buildup of participation over time. That hasn't happened yet as much as I'd like, but there are programs in Bridgeport, like Groundwork Bridgeport and others, where there are youth that are the programs are interested in projects like this because it's an education opportunity for the children. Yeah, so we had a church group come up 2 weeks ago from New Jersey just because they wanted to learn about coastal adaptation, and it's a teaching tool for coastal adaptation as well as a working garden, a working landscape. Yeah.
You're seeming to focus on stormwater and rainwater and managing that source of water. What influence is the saltwater playing?
Yeah.
I mean, after Sandy, we had all these wonderful places in Brantford that had rain gardens along that all of a sudden were salt water instead of fresh water, and plants were dying.
Yeah, that's a great question. And Juliana and I were just talking about this because I think there's a lot of a need, and some of the things that the documents that Dr. Baird is providing, I think, to communities to think about alternative plant selection is critical these days because
Phragmites is perfect.
it's lovely. So the way I'm thinking about green infrastructure in flood zones is that, it's very hard to go to a community and to negotiate coastal adaptation and climate change adaptation landscapes. It's laden with it's laden with, depending on people's perspective on climate change. Still, amazingly, it can be a little difficult to negotiate. Green infrastructure is kind of doesn't have a lot of politics associated with it. It's pretty practical thinking. So the way I think about coastal floodplain green infrastructure is that you can basically design it as a near-term green infrastructure network, but it's going to evolve into your marsh migration channels. So if you think of it and you look at the future sea level rise storm surge maps, and you use those in the topography to guide where you would put your bioretention systems and green infrastructure, you can essentially create your future marsh migration matrix.
So your focus is short term.
Well, no. So these are the intention with the bioretention gardens at Seaside is that they're going to evolve into marsh migration systems, and so the near term, I need to develop a plant palette that's going to function both with periodic salinity and drought and flooding, which is a pretty narrow selection. Yeah. So in terms of aesthetic, I think you lose some of your capacity to build in an aesthetic, or and I think that's partly education with the community. There is the bioretention gardens at Seaside there's a lot of habitat value. We have wild turkey, owls, shorebirds, parrots, mallard ducks, and so it's like a very active environment that way. And I think that's a plus for the community. They're excited about that component. But in terms of a garden function, I think it's harder. It's interesting that they developed the community garden adjacent, and they have raised beds. I'm a little skeptical about how well those are going to work over time.
That's going to get more and more raised.
Yeah, exactly. And I asked them about it, but it's not I try to be pretty open about the challenges that they might face. Juliana and I were just talking about since Bridgeport is interested and faces this challenge of managing landscapes in these coastal areas and parkland. We could, we're thinking about this idea of developing a series of planted plant palettes in research plots that we might put at different grades through Seaside Park. Just as an early stage effort to look at what's going to work in these zones. And New York City Parks Department faces the same issue because a lot of the parkland in New York City is coastal, and they're having a lot of die out as well. So it's not just a local issue.
So is there any strategy for the restoration of species in the gardens?
For the restoration of habitat of a specific restoration targets? You mean like historical reference?
Or, coastal.
Yeah, we're now planting coastal plant communities. Swamp hibiscus, iva, sedges, carex, and other things.
Take advantage of the salt water that's coming
Whoops.
system.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. I would like to take advantage of the salt coming in the system as a kind of management tool, but I wouldn't say that that would be an ideal. But so far, what we've done is planted and have had a fairly large die out. For example, we had a red maple grove in that floodplain area that all died out. In Tennessee, that was a frustrating. So what we've tried this time, and I'm not sure if this is going to work, but we got these what's called smart pots. They're actually like a kind of a polyester or sort of like a geotextile pot, and we raised the ground and planted on top of that. So it's 2 feet higher than where we had it originally. So hoping that that's going to keep it slightly out of the where it floods periodically. But
I mean, in the end, it's inevitable.
yeah. Yeah, so you have to find something that works.
Alex,
Yes.
what was the cause of the death of the red maples?
Just Sandy. Sandy was flooded that whole field, and it was there for
Salt.
salt. Yeah. Yes.
Is it possible to genetically modify some of the plants experimentally so that they can tolerate the salinity of the water?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think there is. I think that's something we should be looking at more. I mean, there are plants that can perform in saline conditions, and so trying to, but it's just a reduced palette, and it's harder with trees, especially when you're trying to get them established in their early establishment phase. If they get a lot of salinity, it's problematic.
Iva and Baccharis, they'll tell you where it's saline and where it's not.
Yeah.
I mean, they know where to stop.
Yeah, good point.
So you've got your demilitarized zone built in.
Yeah, I mean, in the urbanized areas, though, that kind of pattern, that gradient is a little more complicated because, like, for example, Seaside Park is kind of behind what would have been a dune. Yeah. So it's more, it's this combination of built and what we would like to see as a natural ecological function, and how do you manage that, and how do you design for it? Yeah. Another question. Okay. All right. So I'm just going to jump ahead a little bit here. The nice thing about this kind of project also is for the community rating system, for example, this helps Bridgeport set itself up in some ways to essentially get more funding or to identify, to become identified as potentially a higher rated community, which is one of the goals. Okay, so I'm just going to jump into a little more slightly radical proposals here that we worked on with the Rebuild by Design team. And, just to frame this, I think with this coastal adaptation funding that's coming in, that we really need to think big and take advantage of some of the momentum and effort that's been looking at watershed connectivity and fish passage. There's the Connecticut River effort that's going on now, where they're looking at this consortium of collaborative consortium and looking at where fish shad can get through and where there are obstacles and what the cost of changing those obstacles are. And so there's this whole look inland, which would be great to, since we've urbanized a lot of these coastal areas, to try to figure out how to use this funding towards improvements, and particularly when you're thinking about the kind of transportation infrastructure, how coastal that is and how much money is likely to go into transportation infrastructure retrofits over time. But also when you're thinking about like Long Island Sound stewardship sites, the 33 stewardship sites, a lot of those are low-lying and are in locations that are increasingly dynamic. And, there's questions about what do we conserve and what do we prioritize and what do we restore in these locations if we know that sea level rise and other factors are coming in play and what we have, we may not be able to keep some of these locations healthy. So this whole idea of interconnectivity from the coast inland is something that we've been looking at and trying to think about it across the whole structure. And also the notion of the working landscape. So in a sense, you've got in the Connecticut, the cities, the towns were at one point working landscapes, where there was a really close tie between populations and the water and this kind of interactive relationship. And when you think about it now, these towns like Bridgeport, New London, could increase this relationship again, and the in-between spaces where you have, Guilford or smaller towns and municipalities, there's a lot more marsh ecosystems. So you could kind of look at working landscape and marsh ecosystems maybe in the near term in terms of restoration and rehabilitation, in the long term in terms of economic revitalization around aquaculture or, fish populations. And thinking about that, you have to start thinking initiatives to think big, which are actually uncommon. So it's important to promote the river ecology and other kinds of programs that are looking at it this way. So like the Pequannock, for example, has a watershed-based plan. There's a lot of issues in terms of where you might rehabilitate this system, given the the amount of development downstream. Trumbull, for example, doesn't have a sewer treatment plant, and that might be a good opportunity to think about green infrastructure and other strategies as they relate, because right now they're basically shifting their waste down to Bridgeport's municipal treatment systems. And then I mentioned earlier those inland waterways that in Bridgeport. So these are pictures of those inland waterways. It's a very awkward situation where homeowners essentially manage these giant, what are for a homeowner a giant culvert. The city has avoided it because it's a risk and a big cost if the city were to have to manage these systems. So we're sort of thinking in the RBD program about this idea of kind of land cover and existing built environment, infrastructure, and habitats, and how to work with across those three sort of factors. And so for the Pequannock River, the purple are proposed green streets that we would develop that would be sort of park strategies as the Pequannock River gets rehabilitated as a parkway, as a greenway with the Pequannock River Trail, and this is long-term, obviously. You could potentially develop stormwater chains as public amenities that start to activate this area of Bridgeport, which right now is has a lot of foreclosed properties and is not doing all that well. Other parts of it are, and it builds on the historic configuration and conditions of the Pequannock River, but also considers kind of the challenges that the Pequannock River faces today, having intense industry on it at one point, and also there's daylighting issues on the Pequannock. There's also the Bunnell's Pond and the dam. So the Pequannock is a highly urbanized landscape here that doesn't have a lot of flexibility in terms of ecosystem development, but you can use coastal adaptation funding to develop green street strategies that would help alleviate some of the CSO infall and also try to rehabilitate or revitalize parts of Bridgeport. And then hopefully get funding to look at daylighting areas along the Pequannock and to recreate some of the upland conditions, and even do some aquaculture development, which is already being done a little bit along the zone. So the inland waterway that I mentioned, the Oxbrook here, that I showed a minute ago, we have this idea, and this is one of these examples where you're really pushing in economic revitalization as a strategy, but thinking about ecological goals, and I'll wrap up shortly. Basically, we took the bus lines, and we took that channel that's embedded in the city and mostly underground, and we said, what if we, where the bus lines intersect with the river, what if we work to reacquire those blocks and essentially knock down the housing there, which are, a lot of them are repetitive flood loss houses anyway, and maybe you could develop for example, a foreclosed property redevelopment where you, as a strategy to move people out of these blocks. So you incentivize a move into a nicer house that's revitalized through a foreclosed property redevelopment. And then as you capture those blocks, you could redevelop them as larger density, so actually increased density, but you design it as an infrastructure system and a hydrologic management system, and then that becomes a transit-oriented development along this riverway, and it starts to slowly repurpose and open up that river and daylight it, and you essentially use the surrounding neighborhood, so you get this urbanized kind of watershed around it that could treat the water and essentially become a bit more of a sponge using a stormwater chain kind of strategy with green roof, et cetera. Yes, you have a question? Go ahead.
Architecturally, are architects considering building homes, houses, businesses up? Away from the water?
Well, so away from is a good question. I mean, Bridgeport is 16 square miles. They don't have a lot of flexibility. They would like to use whatever land development they can. They'd like to get more density in that 16 square miles, which means that they have to be strategic about avoiding retreat wherever possible, recognizing that certain risk levels require, recalibrating the coastline. So yeah, it's a good question. In any case, even if they built in coastal areas, they would develop they're interested in looking at a hydrologic management strategy and at floor elevation levels that are lower the risk.
In Europe, they must be studying this, have centuries in Holland.
Oh yeah, there's many examples in Holland. Yeah, I mean, the thing about the Dutch, there's lots of great examples, but it's also not cheap. And Bridgeport doesn't have the kind of economic drivers. But the Dutch have many examples of floating houses and poldering systems where they really manage water in sophisticated ways. I would love to bring more of that kind of thinking over here. And it's starting. I mean, it's hard to negotiate around the current regulations, with like tide gates, for example, are an interesting opportunity to think about using as a management tool over time, but it's hard to deal with the regulations. Am I wrapping up?
You got a couple more minutes.
Okay. So, the idea here would be to take what is normally like a, typical rainfall event and try to figure out ways of slowing down the water in these urbanized areas, So really taking a typical hydrograph where you have a kind of peak flow and trying to figure out how to increase the runtime so you're getting, you're pushing that hydrograph and not getting as much water infiltrating in the system. So that idea of green infrastructure is already being developed with others, like Save the Sound. Yukon has funding to develop green infrastructure. So this may seem like a radical idea, but there was actually a daylighting project on that river by Felson O'Neill in an area where they didn't have to negotiate housing buyouts. It was a parcel or a piece of land that was owned by the city. So it's not, and there's other downtown green infrastructure programs going on. So even though this seems maybe a little far-fetched, the nice thing about the Rebuild by Design program was it allowed us to think kind of in the future, but we tried to pick up ideas that were around and that were already being done. Yes?
When you're building large buildings these days, like giant lumber yards, things of that sort, the water that is collected in those roofs, that is collected under the ground with massive biosystems, holding systems to let it out at a certain specific rate.
Yeah.
Has any of that been done in Bridgeport?
Oh yeah, I mean there are requirements with land development to maintain the pre-development water flow conditions. So you would build a detention basin at a low point to capture the water volume to make sure that you're not discharging, with a 100-year storm.
More than just retention basins, actual cabins that are built within parking lots and things that you're not obvious.
Yeah, they are doing a bit more of that in Bridgeport. There are a couple examples, but they haven't done a lot of these storage capacity systems yet. The new development, I think they have included that in the development area on the coast that they're building. I don't know if you've seen it. Yes.
So is Bridgeport considering a credits program like DC?
A credits program? Yeah.
Stormwater trade.
Oh, that's a good question.
And if so,
yeah.
Are you considering how the design strategies might?
Yeah, that's a good question. I haven't heard about a credit system yet in Bridgeport, but I should look into that a little bit more. So far, it's been more sort of like let's get something built, and let's negotiate these overly complicated politics to get some demonstration projects constructed.
So for the 319 funding, doesn't allow 319 funding to apply the infrastructure and floodplains, right? That's my understanding.
Mm-hmm.
So are there areas in Bridgeport that aren't in the floodplain that they're doing, bioswales?
Yeah. I mean, the downtown area is in the floodplain zone. The area that they're building here, the Seaside Village project, is in the floodplain. Other areas that we're working on with the Rebuild by Design include Main Street and Broad Street, which are both in the floodplain in the south end. And so, yeah, oops, sorry.
But is there anything not in the floodplain? Actually, that photo where you go back. That one.
Yeah, I don't know why it's doing this, but yeah. Sorry, it's like my whole show. Sorry. We'll try to go back, but I think I'm going forward. This is I would like to finish with this Guilford plan, and then I can wrap up, if that's okay. This is what you were asking about.
Yeah.
That one. Right? I don't know why I'm doing this.
Never mind.
Okay. Well,
So anyway,
this is like the
your focus is on the coastal floodplain, green infrastructure for the coastal floodplain, but is there a supplementary or complementary strategy for green infrastructure in the upland area out of the floodplain?
Yeah. I mean, the Quinnipiac River part was in the upland area, and I think there is a critical need for upland area green infrastructure. Obviously, it's much easier and better in many ways to do it in the uplands. Sorry, I don't know what's going on, but I would say that I'm talking with the Paquonic River Watershed group about upland green infrastructure, and I'm thinking about integrating that into my class this next semester as something to look at in more detail. But I think there's more going on, or there's more opportunity in upland than in coastal right now. Coastal takes, I think, is a little more, well, let's put it, I know of a couple of projects in Bridgeport that are developing in the upland areas because, yeah, it's a different thing with Bridgeport and the city and trying to negotiate green infrastructure versus some of the townships where they have more resources and more coordination. Sorry, I don't know why this is flipping around, but it's odd. This has been happening all day. I'll try to show you really briefly and then we can wrap up. This is Guilford, so we're, I just wanted to say we have a public meeting in Guilford next week on the 18th where we're presenting our, we did the Coastal Resilience Plan with Malone and McBroom and the Nature Conservancy. This is the project that never stops, I don't know why. It's like on some sort of a liner. Sandy 2020. So Sandy condition is very similar to, that's Sandy, and it's very similar to the predictions for 2080 coastal resilience. This is 2080. So you can see that what you can say to a community like this is, well, actually Sandy was kind of a dry run, or kind of, you could see what would happen, what it would be like in 2080. So this is Seaside Avenue here, and Jacobs Beach. Have people been out to this area in Guilford before? Stonehouse right over here. Okay, so what we were proposing is essentially, there's the Amtrak. These houses are all flooded, repetitive flood loss houses here. There's a town and parcel here. Okay, so, oops. What we were suggesting is actually acquiring property, these repetitive flood loss properties, and then developing a cut-fill landscape where you can put in community septic and actually prolong the housing in these adjacent areas. And then acquire some property that this town's already looking for as a transit-oriented development related to Amtrak. And then use those acquired properties to actually increase development in this area. So you're actually increasing the tax base, but you're developing housing types that are lifted, going back to your question, and they have a living shoreline underneath them, so it's actually a town-managed landscape, and it's more of an urban dwelling. And basically, those would provide a new boundary for the town for flood control. They would provide an increased tax base. Over time, this would become a kind of no longer a bridge, and you use the beach itself actually to pull back and become the kind of that transition landscape for this dynamic environment. And then these properties could be, maintained as kind of high-value properties for homeowners that with boat access, or they could become recreational properties as part of a larger recreational programming. So the idea is you actually increase recreation opportunities by pre-planning your cut-fill strategies in the land side, but in the area that's going to be flooded, as kind of boardwalk systems for future, as a future kind of recreation destination park for Guilford. And so this is one of the ideas. We frame this as what we've called them are what we call zones of shared risk, which are essentially, this idea that rather than take on like a neighborhood as a planning population, if you identify, for example, an egress issue like this one to Sachem's Head, where you have flooding that happens here, once or twice a month, and this whole community of 130 houses faces the same issue. So you identify zones of shared risk. You get groups of people that have the same issue in a room to try to plan out what they can do in the future. And so that idea of zones of shared risk is what we've been doing at along South Seaside Avenue in this area. And so that's our kind of planning process. It's going out to public review on the 18th, and the Board of Selectmen and the Zoning and Planning Commission is going to vote on it, essentially. If it gets passed, it's sort of a new way we're designing it as a process of engagement, where we will, the whole idea is that this kind of a process would occur with the public land planning project. So it's really a transparent public process that Guilford neighborhoods or zones of shared risk can go through to figure out how to coastally adapt from the bottom up rather than having a top down. Yes?
What's the funding?
This was from, let's see, we got I think it was a NOAA grant that we got through, and mostly paid from Malone and McBroom's time to help with the logistics around the Coastal Resilience Plan. But TNC and my lab was involved as well on the project. So it wasn't a huge amount of money, but it doesn't. There's already been a lot of development, the hazard mitigation plan, the conservation plan and development that you can build on. Yes. Maybe the last question.
Thank you very much, fellow landscape architect.
That's great. Yeah.
I got some hope. Could you explain to me, some of this is so basic, I mean, from Providence to Denver to Seattle, this has been going on for 40, 50 years. Is it just the politics in Connecticut, or why are we so far behind? It's embarrassing.
So far behind in terms of green infrastructure?
Absolutely, and out west the saying is no creek, no heat. So
Yeah.
Besides capturing the water and making sure we have low flow,
Yeah.
no one's doing that here.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, yeah, you want to go ahead? Sure.
So NBC has been spending $50 million a year at the city of Hartford, and there are people. The NBC is spending $50 million a year in the city of Hartford on the clean water project, it's taxpayer money. And there's been a number of people on the Citizens Advisory Committee asking for green infrastructure for about a decade now. So, the green infrastructure, there's a lot of political forces that are against it, and part of it is just the conventions of the engineering profession and the assumption that there's that EPA Region 1 wants to rush jobs and certain projects. So, but there really needs to be more political awareness around the opportunity for green infrastructure, because in fact, like the Jordanville project, it was done a long time ago, but other cities like Chicago and Seattle will gone way beyond.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
Is that part of the problem that depending on tax money to do this instead of private?
Okay, well, thank you. Yeah.
When is the meeting?
November 18th at 7:30 in Guilford at the community center. Yeah, please come. It would be great to have you.
Where are you holding it?
In the community center.
Well, thanks, Alex.
Okay, thank you.
We have to get going because